Okay, here we are at lecture number 4 for module 1. This is your final lecture before it's time to start doing those assignments and taking those exams, one exam. So you've already learned quite a bit about this first era of history. We're covering 1877 through 1920 in this first module, which is a lot of information to cover. To review, we've discussed racial relations, our foreign policy issues with imperialism. We've discussed the process of industrialization and then the progressive component of trying to fix all of the problems created by industrialization. And now, before we're done, we're going to have to fight and win a world war. So it is a lot to cover. As always, I encourage you to not only listen to these lectures, but look at the video supplements I've provided, do the readings, review the PowerPoint, and make sure that you are really taking the time needed to gather all of this information and assess it. 5 ID terms for this lecture, so make sure that you make note of those. Now, what we have to do before we really get into World War I from the American perspective is we have to understand what it is that's happening over here in Europe in 1914. Although, to be honest, nobody really understands what's going on in Europe in 1914. Basically, European countries have been mad at each other for a long time. There hasn't been a European war in a while. There's a system of secret alliances. There's a lot of tension, particularly between Germany and France. And things are just not in a good place. So if you take a look at this map here, you can see that secretly we have all of these alliances between these people here. So France and Germany are really the catalyst for this. They have this fear that one is going to attack the other, which actually happens quite often, so it's a justified fear. But both of these countries have reached out to other countries for protection. So Germany has basically said to Austria-Hungary, hey, if France attacks, or if I get attacked, if Germany gets attacked at all, then Austria-Hungary, you have to come to our help, and vice versa. So they agree to help each other. Italy gets involved as well, so they agree to help each other. France has the same kind of thing with England. You know, they're going to back each other up in terms of a fight, and Russia gets involved in that as well. So you can see here that all of these countries have these secret alliances, and there are others involved as well, but these are the main ones. So what happens in 1914 is that an Austria-Hungarian official, an archduke, or a man named Archduke Franz Ferdinand, is traveling down here in this baby country of Serbia. And as he's traveling in Serbia, a Serbian nationalist assassinates him. Okay, so Archduke Franz Ferdinand is killed in 1914. Now, Archduke Franz Ferdinand in and of himself is not all that important. I mean, sure, he's a nice guy, an important person, a human, so his life is valuable. But in terms of like global politics, he's not that important. But what happens here is that Austria-Hungary gets mad at Serbia and threatens to attack Serbia. Serbia has connections to Russia, so Serbia reaches out to Russia and says, hey, Austria-Hungary is going to come after us and attack us, can you help us? And Russia says yes, and that sparks off an entire system of secret alliances. So as soon as Russia agrees to help Serbia, basically what they've done is they've declared war on Austria-Hungary. That gets Germany and Italy involved on their side and triggers England and France to get involved on their side. And all of a sudden, all of Europe is at war because Archduke Franz Ferdinand, globally unimportant man, is killed. And so that's how we begin World War I. What that does is it means that Europe is involved in a war that nobody really knows why they're fighting. They're all very angry, but there's not a specific cause that they're fighting for. They're just all at war with each other. And over here, on this side of the Atlantic, we want basically nothing to do with it. We consider ourselves to be isolationists. We don't want to get involved. That's their problem. But here's the problem with that. Money. We are going to start favoring the allies, which are going to be Britain and France and Russia. We're going to start favoring them with exports and loans, meaning we're going to be supplying them with the war, basically, giving them loans to buy war products and even making those war products for them. And so even though we're not involved in the war, we kind of are at the same time. Now, the reason that we favored them versus Germany and Austria-Hungary is, well, 2 things, really. It's Anglophilia, meaning we have a connection to the Anglo-Saxon heritage of Britain and France. We consider ourselves to be like them, and we love, Anglophilia means a love of Anglo-Saxon culture. We're more tied to that, so there's that cultural component. But on a more practical level, we also just have a lot of money tied up in Britain and France. It's where we do a lot of our trade, it's where we have a lot of our businesses. And so we have a vested interest in them winning this fight. Note that there's not really a cause that we're campaigning here. We're basically just saying, well, in this big, weird disaster of a world war, we want people to win who are most like us. Now, this is going to become more complicated as these two groups start to use blockades against each other. Germany is going to develop submarine technology during World War I. They're going to call U-boats. And they use those U-boats to basically create a blockade around Britain and France. So when ships are sailing across the Atlantic, German submarines will sink those ships from underwater, which works really well for Germany. But basically, it's stopping us from trading with Britain and France, and therefore stopping us from making money. And we don't like that. This is going to come to a head in May of 1915 when a British ship called the Lusitania is sunk by a German U-boat or German submarine. Now, this was a passenger ship, and there were 128 Americans on board this Lusitania. And so those Americans died due to a German act of war. And that has the potential to bring the United States into the war. But we're really not ready to go there yet. There's no support amongst the American people for us to go to war, even though Woodrow Wilson, who's president at the time, definitely wants to be involved in the war. There's no American support for that. So we don't declare war in Germany because of this, but we write them a very strongly worded letter. And we tell them that we expect there to be a complete cease and desist of submarine warfare, that the Atlantic waters are public, and that we should be safe to cross them without German interference. And Germany, because they don't want America to become involved in the war, they issue an apology, and they assure us that they will stop the use of submarines, which of course they do not. This letter that I just referred to is called the Lusitania Note, and it basically demands freedom of the seas. So we should be able to use the public waters of the Atlantic without fear of German interference. In response to this event, we will also adopt something called preparedness. Now, as I mentioned, Woodrow Wilson, who's president, he very much wants to be involved in the war because he wants to help determine what's going to happen in Europe after the war. He wants to be part of the peace process. And so he wants America to be involved in the war, but American people are not open to that yet. And so he kind of inches them closer to being prepared for that by instituting something called preparedness, an economic buildup of the military, putting money into the military, beginning to train men, beginning to build up supplies. And he says to the American people, obviously we don't want to get involved in the war, but in the event that we absolutely have to, that another event like this happens, then we want to be ready. And the American people understand that argument. And so we begin preparing for war in 1915. The event that will bring us into the war is in February of 1917. It's called the Zimmermann Telegram. Zimmermann Telegram is a telegram sent from Germany to Mexico. And what Germany proposes to Mexico is that they attack the United States on the side of the Germans, that they ally with the Germans, attack the United States, and keep them distracted, because Germany suspects that the United States is getting closer and closer to joining the Allies to fight against them, and they cannot afford for the United States to do that. So they want Mexico to keep the United States distracted. So they promise Mexico that if they attack the United States, that when Germany and Austria-Hungary win the war, then they will give Mexico back all of the territory that it lost to the United States during the 1800s. Now, this is basically an act of war by Germany against the United States. They're asking Mexico to declare war on the U.S. Now, the British intelligence will intercept this telegram. They will decode it, and they will inform Woodrow Wilson of what Germany is trying to do, and that will be the last straw that triggers Woodrow Wilson to ask Congress to declare war, and we will officially join World War I in April of 1917, 3 years, 2.5 years after the war begins. Now, the reason that Wilson wants to get involved in the war is that he has these ideals that he wants to see promoted in Europe after World War I is over. He thinks that there's a lot of problems in Europe that led to the development of this war that's being fought for no particular reason. And he wants to try to fix those things. Woodrow Wilson is a huge idealist, and he thinks that nations can completely avoid war if they just negotiate, if they just talk their conflicts out. He's an inner therapist at heart, perhaps. But he has these goals that he wants to implement. There's actually 14 of them. They're called Wilson's 14. But I'm only going to ask you to remember 5 of the 14 goals. Those are the ones listed here. Open diplomacy, freedom of the seas, free trade, self-determination, and the League of Nations. He wants all of these things to be implemented in Europe after World War I. Open diplomacy means that there's going to be no more of these secret alliances that he blames for the war beginning to begin with. He wants freedom of the seas, meaning that people can use public waters without fear of interference. This specifically references German U-boats. He wants free trade, meaning that all countries are free to trade with all other countries rather than being regulated. So, for instance, he's referring to China. You'll read more about that in your book. He wants free trade with China, who is very specific about who they will trade with. He wants self-determination for all countries. Well, what he means is all countries that are in Europe, not Latin America, where we're interfering, or Asia, Southeast Asia, where there's a lot of European control. But he wants all countries in Europe to be able to decide their leadership for themselves through self-determination. But the most important goal that he has, the one that is most dear to him, is the League of Nations. The League of Nations is the first version of what we now call the United Nations. It's a body of people, representatives from all of the different countries, well, all of the participating countries, who get together to negotiate conflict in order to avoid war. And Wilson is convinced that if we can form the League of Nations, that there will never be war again. As I said, he's an idealist. These are his goals for Europe going into World War I, and this is why it's so important for him that America is involved. Now, the impact that the war has on American culture is significant. Remember that Americans do not want to be involved in this war. Even though they understand why they have to be after the Zimmerman telegram, they still don't really understand what the war is about or what we're fighting for. And so the government creates the Committee on Public Information, whose purpose is to explain, quote, the cause that compelled America to take arms in defense of its liberties and free institutions. Basically, this Committee of Public Information is designed to explain to people why we are at war, and that it's to defend the cause of liberty. Now, this is kind of propaganda. Well, it's completely propaganda. We're at war, basically, to A, end the war in Europe that's causing all kinds of economic disasters and political disasters, and B, we're at war because Woodrow Wilson wants to determine how Europe is going to behave after World War I. But the Committee on Public Information basically says to Americans that their liberty is at stake, that their way of life is at stake, and that we're fighting this war in order to promote the spread of liberty throughout the entire world. So it really rallies people to the cause, or at least it's meant to. And the Committee on Public Information uses people like academics, journalists, artists, and advertisers to promote this concept that their very liberty is at stake in this war. And it's really the first time that we see the government creating an agency that's designed to influence and manipulate a large group of people. Now, when I say manipulate, that has a negative connotation, but it means to shape the views of. This agency is designed to make people feel supportive of the war, even if they didn't originally. Now, during World War I, we're going to see a large outbreak of fear. Because there's this idea that our very liberty is at stake, we kind of view everybody as an enemy of us and of our liberty, particularly German Americans. We have a lot of German Americans who have immigrated over to the United States during the industrial era and progressive era, and they are now viewed during World War I as the enemy, as people who may be fighting against the United States internally on the side of the Germans. And so we will put 60,000 German Americans in prison during World War I. It's a very similar thing throughout our history, we will put a lot of Japanese Americans in internment camps during World War II. After 9/11, we will put a lot of Middle Eastern Americans in Guantanamo Bay. So this is something that happens throughout our history, and we're going to see really the first main instance of it here in World War I with German Americans. Along with this is this idea of intense Americanization. And we ask ourselves a lot the question, does dissent equal a lack of patriotism? Well, in theory, in America, no. You're allowed to disagree with your government. You're allowed to even speak against your government, and that's part of freedom of speech. And it doesn't mean that you're not a patriot. In fact, in many cases, it can mean that you are a patriot. But during World War I, there was the idea that if you didn't support the war, you were not a true American. You were a traitor to your country if you didn't support the war. And that was because there was such an intense movement to create support for the war. And so it became a very dangerous time to disagree with the government. Two of the acts that lead to this dangerous time are the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918. The Espionage Act says that there should be no spying and no interfering with the draft, which are pretty reasonable laws to make. But that third component of the Espionage Act, no false statements that hinder the military, was very subjective. And what it really meant, the way it was implemented, was that anybody who publicly stated that they were against the war was in violation of the Espionage Act. They weren't allowed to say that they didn't agree with the war effort. This becomes even more intense when the Sedition Act is passed in 1918. It said that any spoken or written statement that criticized the government was a crime. And a lot of people were put in prison, some for 10, 12 years, just for making public speeches saying that the government had made the wrong decision in getting involved with the war. That's a very dangerous precedent to set because it inhibits free speech and it promotes the idea that if you don't agree with what your government has done, then you're a danger to the government. But this is going to be a rampant issue during World War I. What this forced Americanism was doing was trying to create one standardized culture. We're very aware of our diverse culture of immigrants during World War I. We have immigrants in the United States that come from all of the countries involved in the war. And that makes us very nervous. And we want to try to force assimilation and teach those immigrants how to become Americans in order to promote this intense Americanization. Some of the ways that we do that are we try to rename July 4th Loyalty Day in 1918, which is a very different connotation from Independence Day. It was the idea that if you were a patriot, you were loyal to your country no matter what. Other states would outlaw foreign languages, particularly German. It became illegal to speak German in the United States because of this fear of the otherness, because of this fear of anything that was not 100% American. As sort of an amusing example of this, we even decided to stop using American words with German origins, like sauerkraut, which became Liberty Cabbage, and hamburger, which became Liberty Sandwich. So if you were really patriotic, you could put Liberty Cabbage on your Liberty Sandwich, and then nobody could accuse you of not being a patriot. Now, the cultural impact on this war or on the country was incredibly significant, and hopefully the movie that you watched, Iron Jawed Angel, before we began this lecture, shows you just how powerful that enforced patriotism was. And you can see, if you think back on the reaction to those women who were protesting against Woodrow Wilson, you can see examples of that forced Americanization, of that idea that dissent was not acceptable during a time of war. You can see that implemented there. We're not involved in the war for very long. It's not very long after we get involved that the war comes to an end. Germany and Austria-Hungary are defeated because of the fresh influx of American troops. And so on November 11th of 1918, the war ends and it's time to decide the peace treaty and the peace process. And this is going to be very complicated. It's also what Woodrow Wilson has been living for. This is his moment. This is when he wants to be part of the negotiation and make all of these new regulations for how Europe is supposed to behave. The peace treaty is going to be called the Treaty of Versailles. And this is an incredibly important document. It doesn't achieve a lot. of what Woodrow Wilson wants, because he basically saves all of his chips and plays them all for the League of Nations, which will be created by the Treaty of Versailles. But I want you to remember the Treaty of Versailles for two things. One is that the Treaty of Versailles blames Germany for the entire war. Okay, so it says that the war is Germany's fault. Now, Germany didn't begin the war. We know that the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand sparked off a system of secret alliances, and that caused the war. But Germany is accused of making the war worse with their U-boats, with taunting the United States or taunting Mexico to try to get the United States involved. They're accused of that. And so they're assigned blame for the war. Their military is limited, they lose land, and they are forced to pay war reparations. Basically, they have to pay all of the other countries back the cost of the war. A huge sum of money. It's an insurmountable sum of money, and it's going to completely destroy the German economy. And the reason that this is so important is that it sets the stage for World War II. In fact, historians say that as we get further and further away from World War I and World War II, in the historical sense, we will begin to view them as one war, the second created by the ending of the first. Germany is going to be destroyed by this, and that's going to start growing the seeds that Hitler will play off of to take control of Germany in the 1930s. So that's a very important thing to remember about the Treaty of Versailles. It blames Germany for the war. The second thing that I want you to remember is that it creates the League of Nations, which is a collection of cooperative countries. This is what Woodrow Wilson has been asking for this whole time. It's what he wants. It's more important than anything else. And he's so excited to establish this League of Nations with the Treaty of Versailles. But when he comes back to the United States and announces that this League of Nations has been realized, U.S. Congress decides not to join the League of Nations because it will make them too connected to Europe and entangle them too much with European affairs, and they prefer to remain isolationists. This will be devastating to Woodrow Wilson, who will basically check out the rest of his presidency because of how deep his disappointment is that he couldn't achieve this even after fighting and winning World War I. One more note that I'll make is here in these pictures, you can see that there is a lot of self-determination realized by the Treaty of Versailles. Originally, this map here shows the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then you can see how it's broken up. This land here is broken up into a bunch of different countries that get to govern themselves. Austria here, Hungary here, and then Yugoslavia coming out of that, Czechoslovakia, Poland coming out of that. So we get a lot of countries in Europe from the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was created by the Treaty of Versailles. So that's another significant component here. Now, as we end World War I, we're going to enter a time of power for the United States. They're going to emerge from World War I as the main economic power, and that's really going to set the stage for where we'll begin in Module 2, which is the 1920s. But for right now, what is important for you to do is go over this information, go through your reading again, and make sure that you've watched Iron-Jawed Angels for more context about both the Progressive Era and World War I, and then begin preparing to turn in your assignments for this week. If you have any questions at all, please feel free to email me. I'm here to help. Otherwise, I look forward to starting the next module with you with